Kia ora, I'm Rewa Wright, mihi atu kia koutou, me tō kai whakarongo. I am originally from a very humble region in the North Island called the Kaipara region. I've grown up between Tamaki Makaurau and Kaipara. My ancestry is all pretty much in the north, so it's really amazing for me to be welcomed here to Te Waipounamu amidst this really passionate group of artists, makers, thinkers and activists. It's been quite an honour actually, from the point where Vicky contacted me and said, will you come over and do this keynote for Ada? I've known of the Aotearoa Digital Arts Network since about 2002, when a man who you might know called Sean Cubitt invited me to a very early meeting that ADA was having down at Elam at the time. I never went along and I always regret that. So I feel like this is like a little bit of a finalisation where I've finally got to emerge at ADA. I've seen the mahi of many of you in this room, Tracy Benson, Pasha Clothier, of Vicky at different conferences over the years. So it's very special to be with you all here today and connecting in this fashion. So my talk is going to be sort of a speculative experiment. Okay, that's really what I do. I don't really deliver presentations as such. I don't have a PowerPoint, okay? But we're really going to be having a dialogue, you know, between all of us in this room about what we're doing as thinkers, makers, artists, passionate people who are interested in sustainability and Indigenous futures. So my practice is very hybrid. I come out of digital art, but I've also been involved with performance, dance, writing, film over the years. So I'm a very composite being. My ancestry is from Ngai Tawake. On my father's side, I'm named after my 5th great-grandfather, who's also called Rewa. Interestingly, if you meet other wahine from the north who are called Rewa, we're probably all Ngāi Tawake. We're all pretty much named after Rewa, who was a signatory to the Treaty of Waitangi, regretted it later on. I also have a lot of strong ancestry in the Kaipara region. My great-great-grandmother was actually from Te Rarawa, and she migrated down to Kaipara with her husband at the time, Honetana, and they settled us all there. So that's where our whānau marae and my kind of roots are. So I'm going to press play on my video now. It's sort of a bit of an audio-visual presentation, and I'm going to pull out these notes, okay? Because I'm not one of those people that likes to speak from notes, but I have them here just in case, okay? I don't want to be one of those academics that forgets what they're doing. So this is really a conversation about how passionate we're all feeling today about digital arts in Aotearoa. Okay, there's been so much good mahi done in this space, and my contribution is very small. This is a special return for me because I've been living in another country, Australia, for the last 5 years. Okay, and it's been a great place to be in terms of my career, but when I return to Aotearoa, do I miss the whenua? Of course. You know, of course you do. So it's very important for me to be back here and try and, you know, not only communing with you people here today, but also the opportunities over the next few days that I'll have to commune with the whenua around the Whakatū region. I understand there was an earthquake last night. We were actually in the air, so we didn't feel it. But these are sort of the rumblings of rua umoko that, you know, you feel through Te Waipounamu. This is a little excerpt here from the region in Taitokoro where I'm from. Okay, it's video that I actually took about 6 years ago, okay, travelling up through the Rāwhiti region. And it's interesting because when I look back on it today, I see that really it's the bush and the sense of the whole, all of the beautiful whenua that we have in Northland that's really influenced my whole practice. Okay, so I work a lot with plant sensing, and I work a lot with sensing environments. So one of the primary tools that I use is actually a biodata sensor, and it actually takes the electrical signals that come out of living plants, and then with my partner Simon Howden, who's over there in the corner, he actually converts that MIDI data into signals that go through logic, and then we assign different VSTs, different, let's call them human sounds, okay, and we create a sort of co-composed plant music out of that. So this plant music, then it's actually also passed through a program called Touch Designer, which is an audio reactive program, okay, and I use different devices to engage the public. So I've used large-scale installations where people can use gestural devices like the leap motion, okay, to engage with this plant bioelectrical signal. I've used virtual reality headsets, not as VR, but actually converted to a mixed reality situation. Okay, so this is a mixed reality situation here. This is from 2017. So this is very, very old. That's why it looks a little bit clunky, right? The graphics look 2017 clunky. But I wanted to share them because that's kind of where my practice came from, right? And it was this idea that I wanted to create digital signals that also touched Te Wao Nui, okay, that were also in the environment with the bush, with all of the living natural things that I love so dearly. So, because often with digital technology, it's separated, right? So from the Enlightenment, actually going back to the Renaissance, we have this practice in Western civilization of separating nature and culture. And it's completely artificial, okay? And that's the thing that's come for me out of my upbringing with Māori philosophical values, mātauranga Māori, this idea that we're actually already in an assembled whole. Everything is actually just an interconnected being. You know, everything flows together in these different dynamic pathways. So when I came into human-computer interaction, that was what I tried to restore, was the dynamic pathways, okay, to kind of try to gesture back towards this interconnected whole. So it's been an interesting journey for me in terms of my practice. I actually have spent a long time thinking about the differences between Western epistemology and Indigenous thinking. And it's fascinating because there's a big movement at the moment in Aotearoa. Professor Katarina Ruckshall down at Otago is one of the people, and Aroha Hamid down there as well. There's some of the people leading this movement. Also Hemi Whanga for Māori to start thinking about how we can use science and technology to benefit us, to benefit our mātauranga, rather than being sort of victims of this scientific system, which is part and parcel with colonisation. So as most people will probably realise, what's happened with colonisation in general is that I feel like this is in a loop, but we'll see. We'll see if this moves on. Feels like it's been going for quite a while. A man called Captain Cook, really kicked off colonisation in the Pacific through a scientific event, okay? So his official mission was to observe a thing called the transit of Venus, okay? So that's a scientific mission where he came in and he observed the transit of Venus and he collected data about that, and he brought that back to the Crown, okay? So the thing is that we often think of colonisation as something which happens with government and soldiers, but actually I think this instance shows us that science comes first, right? Science can be the pretext for colonisation because through science, governments discover that there are resources out there that they want, right? So they're able to capture and map particular topologies of the land, okay? So that was part of Cook's mission, was he was map making all around the Pacific. Okay, and I think that's really a fascinating process because the idea of making a map is the idea of ownership, right? And it's intriguing if we think about how different voyagers made maps of new lands and then took those maps back to their governments, their own authorities, lodged those maps, and then that became a sort of pretext for ownership. If you think about a similar example today, what if I was walking down the street and I saw a house that I really liked? And I took my LiDAR scanner and I scanned that whole house. And then I went and lodged my scans with the relevant government authority. They let me bring some heavies in, and then I could claim ownership of that place. Okay. So that's really what colonisation was, right? It was drawing a map and then it was claiming ownership. So mapping is obviously really embedded with science and technology. Okay, so the technology of the day for Cook was ink and a compass. The technology of today is digital scanners, it's geodata coming off Google Earth, it's LiDAR, it's sophisticated 3D image making techniques that also allow us to map the world, and this is another form of ownership. Okay, so I think that one of the messages I want to bring across is that as digital artists, even though we use all of these amazing mapping tools, and in my practice I use a lot of these digital mapping tools, we need to also be aware that we need to not try to ever claim ownership over the things that we map. So this amazing digital data that I'm able to take out of plants, okay, these amazing signals that I'm able to co-compose with, I don't own them, okay? They still belong to the plants, okay? They're not mine. So in my practice, I see the plants as co-composers, okay? I don't see that I own them, I'm not extracting them as a resource, okay? I see them as a companion that I can co-compose with. So, so I'm going to play you something quite interesting. Okay, many of you have probably heard about quantum entanglement. Have I got any physicists in the room? That's great, because I'm terrible at physics. So I always ask if there are physicists here, okay, because always they know more than me. But I've got a little podcast, okay, and it goes for about 5 minutes. I first heard it on an Iris van der Tween YouTube video, actually. She's an amazing scholar. She's actually one of the pioneers of the sort of critical post-humanities movement. And I would highly recommend her work. Anyway, she found this podcast from a team called Miller and Spiegel. They're a sort of science podcast group on national broadcasting, and it explains perfectly this phenomena of quantum entanglement, which I'm then going to go on to discuss. So I'm just going to hit play, and in a few moments this should start. So if you did want to look up the full podcast, okay, that's the URL there. I'm also going to be providing...
News, This is Invisibilia. I'm Elise Spiegel. And I'm Lulu Miller. One day last summer, because we wanted to see something truly magical, Lulu and I found ourselves standing in front of a huge table covered in lasers and mirrors, while a very nervous physicist hovered nearby.
I try not to bump anything here.
The nervous physicist, and our guide for the day, was a grad student from the University of Maryland named David Huckle.
It doesn't look like these things do anything, but I promise you, all of the pieces on this table are important.
And David had brought us to the table because he wanted to use the many lasers and mirrors to try to perform something called quantum entanglement.
Yeah.
He was going to try to take two separate atoms and, using his laser, turn them into the same thing.
At the simplest level, entanglement is just the idea that two things that are separated in space can still be the same thing.
That's Jeff Brumfield, the physics guy at NPR, who we brought along to help us try to make sense of what we were about to see.
You can have an object that exists in two different spaces and still the same object. I mean, that's wild. That's totally weird, right?
Yes.
So if you look at that screen right there.
So, David directed our attention to the first atom, which sat in a metal box on one side of the table. You could actually see it on a screen right above the box. It looked like a little pulsing green dot.
Wow. So you're looking at it right now.
And then he pointed us to the other atom, 4 feet away across the table in an identical metal box.
We typically refer to the atoms as east and west because, well, the cardinal directions.
Two separate physical things in two different places. They pulsed and spun at their own rate. They were completely different individuals, so to speak. But then David pressed a button.
Yep. 1, 2, 3, go.
And lasers shoot out of this contraption on the table, and those lasers hit the atoms and make them spin faster until they each emit a photon, which David and his team can make crash into each other in a way that then connects and entangles the atoms that those photons have left behind them. Now, to know whether it has actually worked, David has rigged up a device that makes an audible click anytime entanglement is actually successful. So we wait. And then
So there's entanglement going on right now between these two chambers.
those two atoms, east and west, are now one, even though they still sit 4 feet across from each other on a table.
And it's amazing. You can wave your hand in the middle
Isn't
of it.
that
It doesn't
wild?
affect it.
Wow. If David and his colleagues did something to change one of the atoms in its little box, they could be 100% certain that the other atom, still in its little box, would also change.
It's almost like destiny.
Now, the US government is actually funding this work in the hopes of making a computer network, a quantum computer network that could ensure with absolute certainty that information that traveled between two parties was not breached. And so far, scientists have been able to get entanglement to occur at a distance of just over 88 miles. Though theoretically you could fly one atom to the moon, and still if you affected it in some way, the other atom back on Earth would be affected instantaneously in the same way.
I mean, that's wild. That's totally bizarre. The guys who do this research don't understand it. They tell me they don't understand it. It's just there. It's, it's math and it works.
And you don't even need lasers to get it to work. Quantum entanglement, the scientists told us, probably happens all the time in the natural world. Like there could be one particle of you right now entangled with a person that you just passed on the street.
The idea that two objects that are physically separated, I mean really physically separated over miles or, eons or whatever, time, space, what have you, are still the same thing is something so foreign. I think it just makes me cautious, I guess, about what I think is possible.
So I wanted to play this, right?
What I think I understand about the way the world works, because there's this very common thing at a very small level that doesn't correspond to anything we understand about the universe.
And that's fascinating, right? So they don't understand how it works, right? And we're always told with scientists, it's all about empirical discovery. We can validate our experiments. We've got the data to prove it. We've got the hard evidence, right? And those of us from the humanities, from Indigenous futures, from art, are always told that we don't have the hard evidence, that we need to get the data, that we need to be more empirical. But here, with quantum physicists, with this phenomena of entanglement, they're admitting they don't know how it works, right? And I think that's the beauty of science today, right? Is it is actually changing to acknowledge that there's magic in the universe, there's cosmology, there are forces beyond our control. We don't know where they come from. We may never know. And that's okay, right? Because we can engage with them, we can harness them, we can channel them. They're flowing through us anyway, right? We can engage, we can do things that are positive with these forces. We don't need to quantify, capture, we don't need to own these forces. We can flow with their dynamic turbulence. So all of us in this room today are already entangled, all 20 people, right? We may not have spoken yet, we may not have touched yet, but our atoms have touched, our photons are maybe entangling right now. I've walked across the room, I've been in different spaces, you've all done the same thing, right? And what's actually happened is that we've left atoms behind us. We've left nanoparticles, and other people's bodies have picked them up, right? And this process is going to go on endlessly. We don't know how long, right? There's a wonderful philosopher out there, she's called Karen Barad. She was originally a quantum physicist. Okay, she's very influenced by, she has a good friend called Donna Haraway, and together they've built this really amazing mahi in the critical post-humanities, which is really overturning the way conventional science and humanities are thought of, right? So we had this idea coming from the Enlightenment, from a man you've probably all heard of called Descartes. He had his edict, I think, therefore I am, cogito ergo sum, which really got us into the idea that we should be separating mind and body, right? That mind and body were two different things. But now the enlightened people amongst us in the last 20 years have come round to this idea that there once again should be holistic behaviour in a more assemblage kind of situation. So where I come from, okay, in mātauranga Māori, we've never lost that idea. Okay, there's always been entanglement. Everything has always been a sort of a whole. Okay, so when we think about ideas like wairua, you know, life force, or we think about ideas like mauri, which is a state of being. So there's three main states of mauri. There's mauri moi, mauri oho, and mauri ora. This is not from my research. This is from the research of an amazing man who I used to share an office with 20 years ago, briefly, called Taina Pohatu. He's done a lot of work in health and well-being in Aotearoa. He has a wonderful article which you should look up called Rethinking Human Wellbeing Through Mauri. I'm going to share a bunch of references over the next couple of weeks with Vicky if you're interested. But he's done some incredible work with Mauri and how that connects not only with tikanga but with all our everyday relationships. You know, and how we can use Mauri to actually advance our own well-being in our communities. So when I hear these ideas about quantum entanglement, I think about Mauri and wairua. And I think about how with, not only just with mātauranga Māori, but also with Indigenous knowledges worldwide, you know, Indigenous thinking has never really lost that idea of connectivity, okay, that we have this really vibrant and dynamic whole that everyone is a part of, that every living thing, every object which we think is an inanimate object is also a part of. You know, all of the wood in this room, all of the carpet, all of the objects that are around us, right, is always entangled with everything that we do. Okay, everything comes from a material basis, but it also comes from a spiritual and cosmological basis. So there's no separation in Indigenous thinking between the mind and the body. So with my own work, okay, with plant signalling, okay, that's really where it started, was this idea that I wanted to make visible some of the connections that we have with plants, okay, and these connections are often thought of as invisible because in, you know, Western society, you know, we go to beautiful gardens, we look at plants as passive, right? We're interested in the flowers and the blooms less than the leaves. We're not interested in the weeds. We're not interested in the wild parts, right? So what I wanted to do was bring a little bit of wildness back in, and I wanted to make visible some of these electrical signals that are coming out all the time. So plants are carbon-based life forms, obviously, as are we. We have an electrical signal flowing through us, as do they. So when we touch a plant, our signals actually combine. And the electrical impulse that comes out of the device, this MIDI sprout device that I connect up to the plant, is actually a combination of the human body and the plant body. So it's a co-composition. I want to recommend this amazing device which you can all buy online. Okay, it's designed by a man called Sam Cusimano. I think he's calling it Plant Wave at the moment. I got mine back in 2017. It used to be called MIDI Sprout. I know he's rebranded a few times, but he's an amazing engineer who's really at the forefront of plant signaling. He got his research off a former CIA operative who was developing capacitive sensing to help with interrogations. Right, but the same person actually started connecting up plants as well. So it's really fascinating. There's a lot of fascinating research around plant signals. Okay, an interesting thing about plants is that if you move up to them, they start signaling more. Okay, if they're alone, they're quieter. Right, it's a bit like cats purring. Right, they say that cats just purr for humans. Right, cats aren't purring to each other all the time. But when a human comes up and pats them, they start purring, okay? So there's already that kind of sense that there's energy flows, okay, that the plants are actually sensing energy, other energy flows when they're approached. So that's sort of part of the work that I started doing. Because I've always been interested in computer vision technologies, of course my natural response was to combine it with mixed reality headset. So this view that you see here is actually looking through an HTC Vive headset, which I've placed a leap motion gestural sensor on the front of. So you can see the sort of keyhole in the middle. That's actually the nose part between the left and the right eyes. Okay, and all of this data here, okay, it's created through the wiri action that I'm performing, right, as I'm looking through the sensor. So the sensor's on my head, okay, it's picking up the movements of my hands, right, and then the hands are moving the data. okay? But it actually didn't even start with me, it started with the plant, right? All I'm doing when I do this is I'm pushing the signals from the plant around, okay? So I'm co-composing with it, okay? It's not coming out of me as the human-centric force, I'm co-composing with it. So as I'm touching this plant, okay, it's already signaling. You can see I'm very, very gentle with the way that I touch it, okay? And our signals are combining, and then they're going through this data network that I've created with Touch Designer. I was using Unity a lot there for the gestural interactions and for the actual augments part. So you can see that that data, it's technically called an augment. So it's an augmented layer. So that's sort of really how it started, was this idea of wanting to communicate. Okay, it didn't really start with the technology, but because I've always been interested in computer vision, that was already folded, that became folded in there, but it started with the desire to have this kind of communication which couldn't normally be seen, and which, you know, in some ways kind of pushed the boundaries of how we are taught in the Western episteme to engage with plants. So you notice in this talk a lot, I'll be talking about the Western episteme, and then I'll be talking about Indigenous futures. So they are two different things, right? They're two different thought systems. Okay, so I try to distinguish between the two, but if it gets confusing at any point, you can just ask me a question at the end. Okay, so I still work a lot with this kind of technology, but I've gone away a lot from the headset technology, okay? Part of it is to do with my eyesight, which has got worse, but also what happens with headsets when you present them to an audience is there's a certain amount of people who feel sick and nauseous, okay? And that's a thing to do with the evolutionary biology in the brain. Okay, it's actually more women than men feel nausea in a VR headset, and it's about 30% of women. So what I actually discovered through working with headsets over a couple of years is that, you know, I tried to be very inclusive with my technology, but I realized that the headset technology is actually not that inclusive, right? Because of this percentage of people who always feel physically nauseous. So I've moved away from that, and now what I focus on is more large-scale installations and large-scale kind of gestural pieces that everyone can be involved with. And I think that's an important point, because in education, you know, there'll be some of you who work, no doubt, teaching. Is anyone else teaching in this room? Yep. So lots of teachers here. Okay, so there's